Matt, how's it going?
Hello. And
Hi, everybody.
Hey,
Can
look
you hear
who's here.
Good to see you in 2 dimensions, but I wish it were 3.
You can actually see us. There we are. Oh, we're in
Yeah.
California.
And we have, 2 inches of snow out here and it's coming on down.
Well, that makes me feel better because this morning I was like, oh no, did I make the call too soon?
Hi, everybody.
So all you wimps that don't want to drive in the snow.
We're delayed.
I was looking forward to cooking all sorts of stuff up with Steve Grasty. It was just gonna be him and me. I'm gonna have gotten into some serious mischief there, I think.
You're on delay. Way delayed. Way delayed.
All you wimps that don't want to drive in the snow.
Did we put in a delay?
It's not me driving, it's all those other people.
Have Dennis say something.
Dennis. Hi, Dennis, can you hear us?
I can.
Are we delayed?
I don't know. Talk again. I'll see if your mouth moves.
Does it look like one of those old movies?
I grew up lip reading and it used to drive me crazy when they were all, oh my God.
He's gonna do it. He's everything in line.
Okay, I think we're good. Daniel's in here trying to help us get technology to work, so, sure. I don't think we should. be out there, but yeah.
I don't know how Steffi's gonna do.
We got the fans going. We should be okay.
And Doug Dorr just sent a note. He'll be online shortly.
Okay, and I don't, is Jonathan on yet? I don't see his name.
Yes, yes, he is.
Yeah,
There
I'm
you
here.
are.
Hello.
Yay. Hi.
Hi, Liz. How's your young professional doing?
Napping right behind me, so I'm sure you'll get a visual of her at some point. when she's
Yay.
listening.
We're waiting for that. It's the only reason we're here.
Yeah, for sure.
I was hoping I'd get a cuddle.
I know, it's like, oh,
Well, at the next meeting for sure.
okay, we'll just pass her around.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And everyone will be sick together.
That's okay, it's worth
It
it.
is, yeah.
Oh, she doesn't get.
Okay, so I think Doug is the only other
short.
one we're waiting on, right? Okay, and everybody's here. So in addition to the snow and the calling it and all that good stuff, Chris, who does all of our logistics, got called to grand jury starting yesterday. So it's been the week of like, for real, like, could all that really happen? So Daniel's in the room with us and he's got us handled. So hopefully between him and Katie and Denise will all stay together here and actually be able to share screens and all that good stuff. So because Chris is not here, Jennifer, you and I haven't had a chance to chat, but we are not going to do the best practices because Chris was going to do that. He did want at least to mention that we're on target with everything in the best practices, so there's nothing to be worried or alarmed about. We'll catch it up next time when he can be with us and do it. But so we won't be doing that. So I think we're just going to be doing real estate. And JR and Matt, I think I'll turn it to the two of you because you probably know who's presenting in what order. I see Tabitha, but I won't do that to you, Tabitha.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think probably most of this is going to be on a slideshow that I'll pull up pretty quick, and then JR, Tabitha, Alice, and I will kind of I'm counting on them for support. I'll go through the slideshow itself, and then they'll be able to help provide some context and different things as we go through this. today. Can you hear me okay?
We
I've
can.
I've gotten better connectivity, so I'm very thankful for that. I shouldn't blank out too much.
Don't jinx yourself.
I haven't said anything for sure. So we wanted to continue the discussion on property acquisition. We're hoping we might be able to wrap up the criteria portion of that, the acquisition criteria portion of that today. I don't anticipate it taking the 3 hours that we have set aside today, but that's probably another thing I shouldn't say out loud because I probably just jinxed us and we'll be here for the 3 hours. But as we do that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a slideshow real quick. One moment here. And let me know if you all can see that.
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Super. Okay, so I'll go through kind of a quick overview and then we'll dig into the criteria themselves. Again, I don't anticipating it taking 3 hours, but there are some that I think are going to create pretty good discussion and some potential adjustments too. So just an overview of what I'm hoping we can cover today. Just a quick review of some of the things that we've discussed over the last couple of meetings, and then dig into the acquisition criteria and then talk about what some of the next steps will be. Where we've been, we've talked a little bit at the June and September meetings about property in general. We talked, I think, acquisition and disposition at those meetings. In the November meeting, we dug a little bit more into kind of the history around acquisition and it focused more on property acquisition. We talked through some of the history. We each gave a little bit of a background history of how and why the agency has acquired property. And this is kind of a continuation of that to look forward about how we do that in the future. We reviewed some of the policies, rules, and statutes. So the policy around land acquisition and exchange, OARs and ORSs, the park system plan. I think I sent some of those documents out after our last meeting, as well as the acquisition criteria. As a reminder, and I guess I didn't fully understand this when Cammie mentioned this to me about a year ago. The policy is so heavily written with rule and statute that there's just not a lot of flexibility we have in terms of interpreting that language. The place that we do have more flexibility is around the criterion. So that's why we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit more today. Some of those are still pretty well tied back to statute and rule, but there are others that we do have a little bit more flexibility around. So I wanted to give the next couple of slides, and again, I wish I had more pictures in here, but there's so much kind of verbiage that we need to get to. It's a little bit more of a pragmatic slideshow than I normally like to give. So a couple of notes about the criteria as it relates to the rule and statute. There are things that are required of the agency. The first is we're required by rule and statute to establish a list of priorities of it or properties of interest. That's what we call our watch list. Cammie was going to cover that today. Unfortunately, she's out sick, and so she's not going to be able to make it. So we'll postpone the discussion of the watch list until our April meeting. That prioritized list or watch list is created with a rating system. In our case, we've used the criteria that we'll go over today to create that rating system. We've stayed away from a numerical rating system and created more of a high, medium, and low priority system because it just gives us a little bit more flexibility when properties come up quickly that we want to take advantage of and things like that. So some of the other requirements that are from rule is considering master plans, identifying properties in master plans, acquiring properties specifically directed by the Oregon legislature. It also does give us some flexibility here, acquiring other properties that contribute to the established goals of the agency, but were not previously included on a list. I like that we're able to have some of that flexibility. Further down in the rule, it starts really kind of honing in on some of the things that the agency needs to use for criteria around the department's mission, development and operational costs, geographic distribution, diversity of values, public demand, and other factors that contribute to its feasibility to become a state park. I'm not going to read through all of these, I promise, but I want to point some of those things out because they really help kind of dictate what we can and can't do. So this is another section of the rule, again, talking about protecting really the pieces that make up the mission of the agency, consolidating state park parcels to create more efficient management, providing buffers, providing access, and then kind of a sense of urgency behind acquisition. That last one addresses opportunities that may be lost to the department if acquisition is delayed. Then jumping to statute, again, this lines out 3 additional criteria. That first one talks again, even though it's referenced in rule, it talks about it in statute as well, in terms of the sense of urgency. Criteria to protect significant cultural and historic properties, and criteria to satisfy the need for overnight and large group use facilities on the perimeter of urban population centers. That one's going to come up more in a little bit here. Okay, so we'll talk through each of these 11 criteria that the agency currently has. On the slide, we'll have the criteria, and then either the rule, statute, or if there's language from the park system plan, we'll have all of that kind of referenced in the same slide to help give some context. So the first one, there are a few of these, like I mentioned earlier, and these first couple are a good example where it's so well defined in rule and statute that we don't have a lot of flexibility. So I anticipate some of these we're going to go through pretty quickly. There are others that aren't defined as well that I think we'll have some pretty good discussion on. This first one, again, as you can see there, the criteria is mission impact. So areas of outstanding natural, scenic, cultural, historic, recreational significance for present and future generations. That's kind of verbatim out of that rule at the bottom, and it's referenced also in statute there. We can talk through these. If you have any questions around some of the ones that maybe we don't have as much flexibility on, we can talk through those. But again, I feel like some of these are, for lack of a better way to put it, set in stone. Are there any questions on this one before we move to the next one?
Hey, Matt, this is John.
Yeah.
In terms of the criteria, so it says it shall include, but need not be limited to. So we have to hit like all 3 of these criteria here in 390, 100, 112. I'm not sure if I understand. This one knows like does every acquisition or development need to hit like all 3 of these criteria? It needs to be at least meeting these criteria, but not limited to. So I just want to make sure I'm reading that every that these are required criteria for all these.
No, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. That's something I probably should have addressed. So we have 11 total criteria right now. It's pretty rare that an acquisition would hit maybe even 7 or 8 of those. Generally speaking, you know, there are some I think that are probably more critical than others, like the mission impact and some of the things that are outlined in rule and statute. But a property in all likelihood is probably never going to hit all 11 of the criteria. Does that help?
Yeah, for sure. I just wasn't sure if there's anything, because I read through reread through a lot of this last night, and I was just kind of losing track of what is required criteria versus what is eligible criteria. And sure. I think that's one of the things. I think we know sort of like theoretically, like this stuff fits, this stuff doesn't fit, but what are things that it has to meet? It obviously has to meet one of these, or does it have to meet one of the 11 or just sure. Close enough? So I think at some point getting that clarity will help us in terms of what do we need to shift or not shift. So yes, you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. And Alice or Tabitha or JR, if you have additional information on that idea, you know, of what's required versus, you know, what's not, that would be great. But I think, you know, some of the stuff, again, going back to, and I can go up real quick again. You know, this language from rule, a lot of that really does create a requirement for what we're looking for in those properties, for sure. And then as we get down a little bit, again, some of the ones that we'll have more discussion around, it's a lot less prescriptive, the rule and statute. And so that's the area where we have some more flexibility around.
Steve, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Hold on, Matt.
You bet.
So, yeah, stay on that slide a minute, would you, Matt?
Yeah,
Oop,
this one?
no, the 390.112. One more, there, that one.
Okay.
So is the only way for the commission to ever hear about something is that it be proposed by the department? What if an individual wanted to propose something, or a commission member or other, is it have to be the department proposing it for the commission?
No, we get proposals
All the time.
from all over the place. We truly get proposals kind of from in every way you can imagine. And that includes if say a private citizen approached you and with a piece of property that they thought the department might be interested in, that's absolutely an acceptable way for us to learn about properties. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm just reading the words and making sure that there's flexibility there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Per se, when somebody brings you Shipsy Shores because somebody dies and donates it, or says that it's coming to us.
Gypsy sword.
Just want to make sure our attorney's awake.
Yeah, Judge Grasty, the shall propose language only refers to the department has to propose the criteria. It's not pertaining to proposals for acquisition themselves. Does that help?
Yeah. I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah. No, thank you. Any other questions?
It moves.
I think
So-
JR has a question or comment.
Oh, sorry.
See if you
Yeah,
can
no
talk.
worries, Matt.
Okay.
I was just gonna add to that point, is when approached by outside of agency staff, if it's just a member of the public or a nonprofit, we actually have a land nomination form that allows that we can provide to somebody to fill in kind of the accurate information about the property and allows them to kind of say why they think it should be acquired, and they can get that to us. And that's what kind of helps us do some of those initial stages. But I think, you know, to Matt's point, we get them a lot from all manner of people. Like sometimes it's a family member after somebody's passed away and they want, you know, sometimes it's a county commissioner, sometimes it's a neighbor. So they come in all the time. So we've been using that land nomination form kind of as that tool on how to pipeline that into our regular process. And we've used that for the last several years.
That's a great point. And 2 notes on that. I think I did send that out to you all as part of that last email packet. And essentially the information that we're going through today for the criteria is once we get one of those parkland nomination forms back, this is the criteria we use to decide whether or not to bring a piece of property forward to the commission. Yeah, that's a great point, JR. Thank you. Anything else before we jump to the next criteria? Okay. So the next one is enhance existing area. As we talked a little bit about in the workshop at our November meeting, this has been a big focus of the agency over the last few years, is really solving operational issues, solving natural resource issues, enhancing properties that we already own. So if you think about the Kent acquisition that we did at Wallowa Lake, or the Gleason property at Kam Wah Chung, those are good examples of kind of enhancing existing areas. And there's language in the rule that really kind of prescribes some of that. So talking about in B there, consolidates state park parcels, trail system, greenways for more efficient management. again, down in 4, the department will look at favorably at opportunities for acquisition and exchanges that enhance the overall management of existing parklands. And then it was also identified as a priority in the park system plan from 2012. So again, this is one, again, not set in stone a little bit. I mean, the rule is very specific around that this is going to be one of the criteria that we use to evaluate lands. Are there any questions or thoughts on this one? Any kind of additional? I promise the next couple are going to be more interesting because it'll create better dialogue, but we got to get through all of them. Okay, I'm gonna move on. There should be a little bit better dialogue on this next one. Because
So
I think,
Matt,
yeah,
this is Steve.
yes,
That last criteria talks about the state park system. Do we have any focus about when it's connecting to other park systems, like a city, a county, or the BLM or whatever?
you know, I'll see if Tabitha and Alice or JR are aware. I'm not aware that we have language in the criteria that talks about that. Having said that, I know that a lot of times when we're doing say a master plan development for a park unit or a system of parks, that we do identify that connection. And kind of coming back to the criteria, the master plan is one of the documents. Any adopted plan is something that we do use to help prioritize properties. So I guess in a roundabout way, yes, that could be definitely considered.
And that has in the past, if you don't mind me coming in,
Please.
in the past, when the criteria, the nomination form is being filled out, this is exactly what you're asking about. How does this enhance or connect other park systems?
Good.
Is sometimes addressed depending on the property. If that is one of the criteria they want us to consider it for, then that's usually addressed on that nomination form. So it's not specifically spelled out, does this connect to other parks? But it is one of the items that are listed under this enhancing existing areas.
Well, and Commissioner Grassi, that's certainly something that we would look at as part of our review process too, is would we be the best host for this piece of property? Or if we know it's available and it's on the market and they're interested in, you know, putting it into some sort of public ownership, is there another steward of the property that would make more sense? But as far as our shared goals around things like SCORP and master planning and like the system plan process, we do look at things like trail connectivity, and those can go outside the boundaries of our park. They can, you know, those kind of trails systems can wind through many different types of public owned land.
Thanks.
All right, anything else before we jump to the next one? All right. So this next criteria is strategic return on investment, which has been defined as favorable return on cost to acquire, develop, and maintain a property or area. This one is not as well defined for the agency in rule or statute. In the rule there, you can see I highlighted the one piece that the rating system will evaluate an acquisition as it relates to the department's mission and development and operational costs. So it does talk about, you know, the costs associated with developing and operating a piece of property, but it doesn't put it in terms of a strategic return on investment. And I wonder if there is a different way to look at that. And you can see I did put an idea around how we might change that language to fit a little bit more what I think the agency's goal would be. Again, using some of our most recent acquisitions, I look at that Smith Rock acquisition where it's enhancing an existing park property, but we don't necessarily anticipate a return on investment. And so the language that I put in there kind of as a draft, or at least a discussion point, is that OPRD has the long-term resources to purchase, manage, and maintain the development and operational costs associated with an acquisition. So it's just a little bit different in terms of maybe not anticipating a return on investment, but knowing, committing to the long-term investment of that property. And I definitely open that one up for some discussion, questions and things like that.
Matt, this is Vicky. Return on investment is not language we want in there. I totally agree. We don't acquire anything for return on investment. We do it for the sake for a whole host of reasons, but that's as we're trying to make some kind of a.
Cedar Falls could.
Yeah. Well, well, your proposed change, I like using strategic investment. I'm not sure that, long-term resources, because long-term could mean a year, and if the governor comes along and says a park a year, are you gonna argue?
Well, that legislative language.
Yeah, and
changes
it does, the language, the legislative language also kind of. I'm a little, I don't know, I'm not having a good suggestion here, other than I'm a little long-term, saying that it has to be long-term, or we're kind of ties us a little tighter at the knot, I
Sure,
guess.
sure.
That's, I guess, is what I'm saying. I mean,
No.
I think we should, but there are times when we can't.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point. Commissioner Allen, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just, sorry, I was trying to think of some way to clarify that a return doesn't just mean a financial return. But it's kind of in there, so that's why I took my hand down, because I was like, it's significant, related to our mission, diversity of values. So I was just trying to, I mean, there's a lot of work in economics to say, how do you recognize that they're non-financial values that are factored in? So I was just trying to look for language, but I didn't have a good suggestion, so I took my hand down.
I mean, it has the geographical distribution, it's got the diversity, the public demand. I mean, it has all the things that would be more of our return on cost versus, because normally when you think about that, you think about a return on an investment financially, right? But for us, it would be the return on the access, the demand, the public need for the space. I think identifying it as more of a strategic investment. But as much as we can talk about the access and the demand and the recreational value return, I think it's probably our best bet.
Okay.
So Lisa, so Matt, if we can, Lisa just said what I was struggling with trying to figure out how to say, it's not necessarily cost.
I
That
don't
seems
think
like
so.
the wrong word.
Right.
Maybe it's the investment word that is bugging us.
Right.
That
It feels
implies a
so.
financial investment instead of a,
It's a recreational investment for the future, right? Like, you just want to make sure that whatever strategically you're doing is actually going to have that return on public demand and access. And so you don't want, I mean, it'd be ideal to have this be something that would prohibit us from doing things like buying, I don't know, there's a property in Tillamook County that I
don't want to buy.
that we've already bought and we've never developed, right? Like,
Yeah.
I didn't say it. But it would give you different criteria to say, okay, so, when you do have those demands externally to get you to buy something that even the community doesn't really want you to buy, but they want the money for it. It's not about a return on cost investment. It's about a return on recreational investment or cultural or historical or whatever.
I'm not sure that this even qualifies as a criteria, the way it's written. The proposed changes, Matt.
Yeah.
Is it a criteria that we have to buy, or we should buy something because we have the ability to maintain it? We have the ability to maintain a lot of things, but that's not
Doesn't mean we should buy it.
that doesn't mean we should buy it.
Right.
I'm just not sure how this fit as an acquisition criteria that is useful.
Yeah,
This idea of because we can afford it, we should buy it?
So-
No,
Yeah.
Commissioner Berger, you bring up a great point, and one of the things that I was gonna discuss in one of the later slides, but I think it's probably more relevant right now, is do we maybe be, and I mention this only because it does identify development and operational costs as, part of the evaluation criteria in rule. But I wonder if we add a criteria, something to the effect of other criteria to be considered, or other things to be considered that doesn't maybe carry the weight of some of these other main criteria like mission impact and those, but it's other things to consider as we're looking at an acquisition. And I wonder if something like this, obviously not these exact words, but maybe they fit
Yes.
into a subset of criteria.
I would agree with that, Matt. This is not a criteria, it's a consideration, not a criteria. And one of lots of considerations. It might be something we.
It depends on the property.
And it's, we may say it fits all the criteria, but we are not able
We
to
don't want it.
maintain it for the for the next forever, or even next year, so.
Yeah.
It may fit all these criteria. I mean, thinking of maybe the Pinnock Mansion or something,
The
yeah,
dome building.
yeah, the dome building. Buildings that might fit a lot of the criteria, but we can't.
You guys are gonna have to tell me what the film building is.
Well, I'll tell you where to drive by it.
Matt, if I might,
Please.
one of the ways we have addressed this particular one is when we have land and water conservation fund conversions and need to obtain a replacement property to meet our obligations. That is seen as a strategic return on our investment because it relieves us of that obligation with the Park Service.
So we don't have to mitigate somewhere else.
So it's not just, it isn't just a matter of, and I see the same thing. Investment means, we should be throwing money at this, but it is sometimes
A cheaper way to.
replacing something to meet an obligation elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the idea is good, but the wording doesn't get there.
Right, I agree with you. We could come up with
More
that.
specific, that's what it is, yeah.
Yeah, but the wording doesn't get there. Have fun with that, Matt. That just got tossed right back to you, didn't it?
Well, I can assure you, I am going to rely on our real estate.
He'll get lots of help.
They are much brighter than I on this.
Yeah, we didn't solve this, did we?
No, that's okay, but it's
All he
good.
wants is feedback.
It's really good feedback. And again, I do like the idea of possibly creating this kind of separate other things to be considered. And this may still fall into that, into kind of an other type category. So no, it's great discussion. And I think the next couple are going to be like this, where it's definitely a little bit more robust discussion. So thank you.
Matt,
Yes.
again, so help me, I'm a little dense here. Tell me why we're doing this. Do we need an update to it? Are we just making sure we're all familiar with it? What's the desired outcome here for going through this?
So
All of it.
it's both. The last time these were updated, I'll back up just a second. If you remember I think it was in the September meeting, maybe it might have been the November one, but we talked about the fact that the property acquisition policy is solid. We don't have good procedures for that. And then the disposition policy, it needs to be updated, but we have great procedures for that. So this is getting us to a place where we have updated procedures for the acquisition policy. Yeah.
They're
No,
pretty
thank-
old, and at the same time, making sure that as things come up, yes, you're all on the same page, but you're leaving this gift to the future, that it is more consistent as things come
Was
Come our
that
way.
comment you're really old about me?
No, the process. It has not been
Well-
updated in a very long time.
Yeah,
And
it's
people-
timely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was gonna say, so these were developed 2012, 2013, I think is when they were kind of adopted. At that time, the commission recommended these are gonna need to be updated in about 10 years. So here we are. You know,
And
getting,
we've been in that disposition conversation a couple times where it's really hard to get you all kind of on the same page when we don't have good process or policy. So Cascadia, Joseph Stewart, now we're having a conversation with Grand Ron around Fort Yamhill. We need the criteria established so we have something to point back to. So when somebody else says, well, hey, we want you to take Pullman, or well, that's ours, but we want you to take the dome building, right? We have real clear criteria about how this is gonna work.
Dome building doesn't fit.
Dome building doesn't fit.
Well, I do want to point out that at the end of this section here, you can see it says the commission will periodically review the rating system. So if, every once in a while, we want to make sure we're in step with exactly what you guys are expecting to see.
yes,
Thanks.
It's a lot.
Oh, it's a refresher from what we said.
And,
last week.
and let me check on this, because it goes back to earlier comment. Our rating system isn't a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's what you mentioned, Matt, which is the high, medium, and low.
yes,
That's our rating system, because we sure don't want 1, 2, 3, 4.
yes.
No,
Yes.
you know what'll happen is all of a sudden something becomes available and it might be a low priority, but it's met the criteria and we have the funds, we have the means, we have the ability. Versus saying we're gonna wait till, if everybody knew everything that was a high, we'd never get it, or we'd pay way times the appraised values, and so it's tricky to have
So
a rating
call-
system.
Calling it a rating system is really
Challenging.
challenging, but that's in statute, right? We have to have a system.
Yes,
That
Yeah.
that was one of the statutory.
yeah,
Did they use the word rating system?
they did.
Can you go to that?
If you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor there.
There it is, the rating, yeah, okay, yeah, they call it a rate, okay, so that's our, which we get out of that by high, medium, low.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
which is a
gives
good,
us flexibility.
which is a good way out, I like that.
Yeah.
It's great.
I like that they weren't as prescriptive with how we prioritize and rate as they are with some of the other things. Yeah, exactly.
But we know what we're doing, I guess they're saying.
Yeah.
And it isn't based on somebody's
Idea of.
idea of what I
know.
want, like, say, the director.
Right.
Okay.
And then just, thinking more about the watch list, and again, we'll revisit that in April, but one of the things, so this is by updating this criteria, we'll be able to revisit our watch list and make sure that all of those properties that are existing on there are relevant, are still a priority for us. And then one thing to consider, we were talking about this at a property meeting, I don't know, a week or so ago, is even with the high, medium, and low ratings on the watch list, even a low rating property doesn't mean it's not very important. If it made the watch list, it's a pretty critical piece of property. And so, again, we'll talk more about that. But just as we're working through this, that's another one to keep in mind.
Matt, does the commission review the watch list from time to time?
Yes.
Never
Yeah.
done that.
Yep. So we'll bring, again, depending on kind of how we get on the criteria, I think we're planning on bringing that to the April meeting, and we'll start doing more regular updates of that watch list with the commission. We'll get back into that practice.
And isn't that an executive session thing, because
Thank you. I was just. gonna ask.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
it's a
not
real
a-
estate
right.
acquisition thing that we don't
We don't want
want.
publicly everybody to know.
Yeah.
Hey, we want your property.
Yeah.
Really, really want your property.
Yeah.
We keep that very, very confidential because it does interfere with negotiations.
It needs to be,
Yeah, great questions.
much as I think government ought not to hide what it's doing, this is the point where to hide's the wrong
A
word.
Fair value.
Okay, should we jump to the next one?
Yeah, that was fun.
I believe it's making more fun here shortly. Okay, so
Oh, another word from the financial sector.
Leverage.
So this is another one I think we'll probably have some pretty good discussion around. There's no language in rule or statute around this criteria. It was called out in the 2012 State Park System Plan. You know, obviously leverage, you know, someone providing donations or, you know, cost share or land and water conservation fund. Those are good things that I think we should consider, but they're one of those things I think we need to consider with eyes wide open because of the long-term potential impacts of some of that external funding. And so we wanted to talk through this one. One, is it a criteria we want to keep as a separate kind of called out on its own, or do we want to reword it, or should this be one that we pull into kind of that other category?
So like when Alice was talking about the Land and Water Conservation Fund earlier, in perpetuity, it has to stay in recreational purposes. And if all of a sudden you want to do something different, you have to figure out where you can find mitigation or replacement land for that obligation. And so sometimes the restraints or the strings associated are, you know, it's a great thing to do in the moment because it's a way to acquire a property, but it may not be the best gift towards or for the future. Or somebody could leverage grants and donations and say, look, we raised all this money to buy this for you. Now go buy it. And we still don't want it.
So it seems to me like this is a consideration. I think Vicky used that word as opposed to a criteria. I mean, I think you would say, gee whiz, there are other resources one could consider. But it seems very, very much something that would depend on the situation, and all the other factors, you know, would need to be weighed. So it seems like a consideration, but criteria seems odd.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So is this a criteria?
It currently is.
It currently is, yes.
And then, so why is the bottom half of that page talk about the state park system plan?
On each of the criteria, I've, with the help of Tabitha and Alice and Jen and the property folks, we pulled out the language from statute or rule or the park system plan, which is an adopted agency plan, as reference to why these are criteria, you know, part of the acquisition criteria. So that is only there just to show the reference of kind of where that had come from back in 2013. Does that help?
It's the footnote for the source of where it came from.
That works fine. I just want to be sure.
It's not a
they're all
statute
together.
or.
Is, so this talks about OPRD funds. Where's leveraging come in if it's a partnership with another entity? And maybe we don't ever have those, but
So it's the OPRD funds complement the larger contribution from external sources. So the external source may be a nonprofit land holder. It could be somebody decides, a friends group decides to raise a bunch of money to have a donation to purchase property.
does state parks have any kind of collaborative effort with a local government, the BLM, federal agency, whatever, on any park?
We have several of them. I don't think for acquisitions.
Oh,
But for
forgot the
other
word
management
acquisition in
or-
the middle of this, thank you.
Yeah. Acquisition.
You know, the acquisition that comes to mind, it would be Iwa-Temlaken, that we
Yeah.
partnered with the 3 tribes and you know, to be able to purchase that property. I can't think of any others off the top of my head. And JR's got his hand up too. He may have some ideas, or Alice.
Yeah, I think so that is a good one, Matt, and also the National Park Service, because they contributed there at Iwa-Temlaken when we acquired.
Yeah.
So I do think there are some examples where my thought on why I would consider it criteria is the example I think of is like the Willamette River Greenway. So we kind of are always looking at like ways to fill in gaps or make contiguous property acquisitions in the Willamette River Greenway. However, they're oftentimes pretty expensive. So if a nonprofit comes forward and says, so what if we bought this $1.8 million property for you? would you accept it, or would you accept it and purchase it back from us over 5 years? To me, that's where I think it's a criteria, because sometimes those properties wouldn't be like the top of our watch list, especially because they're like a $2 million price tag sometimes. However, if a nonprofit wants to cover part of that cost or all of that cost in some cases, then it that's a different consideration. And so to me, it is can be a valid criteria, because sometimes those properties would actually eat up a whole biennium's acquisition budget. Whereas even if we end up paying the full amount, but the nonprofit says, hey, we'll buy it and let you buy it back from us, then that kind of makes it doable. So I do think it's a valid criteria as far as, especially in the realm of nonprofit acquisitions. And I think about the Willamette River Greenway and probably Cottonwood Canyon are probably two of the biggest examples of where we had kind of nonprofit partners doing a lot of acquisitions, because those acquisitions would have exceeded the funds we had at the time.
Yeah.
The other one where the nonprofit made a bigger contribution actually to the acquisition than we did is the Big Creek property at Carl G. Washburn, where TNC paid quite a bit of money.
Okay, hold it. We have a new guest on here. Did everybody hear?
Let me make that big.
Yeah.
Say something out there very quietly, Mom.
Yeah.
I did, sorry. I had a question about, would we ever acquire property that, in terms of the term contribution, are we talking just about financial, or would there ever be opportunity that we would take into consideration on acquisitions around volunteers or other sorts of anything having to do not with funding?
Matt's got control.
I'm not aware of any in the past.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of any, and I can't think of anything outside of either cash or additional property, that has value. But I can't think of anything outside of that.
I was just asking because the way it's phrased, it's purely monetary related. And so if I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
The only example I thought is in the disposition realm, like when the property we used as match for Wallowa County when they acquired the East Moraine, and we actually kind of almost gave it in kind, made a transfer and accounted towards their match. So, but I've not seen it, I don't think, in that avenue for acquisition.
And so that would be at the beginning, the acquisition, but would this pertain to like ongoing? I mean, when we're thinking about ongoing funds of maintaining a property that OPRD provides in the long term, if there's a nonprofit that's providing long-term volunteers,
Sure.
or brings in folks to do consistent cleaning of bathrooms and facilities, is that considered the monetary? We value that as a monetary asset?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think we've actually been talking about that with this one park in Tillamook County. That potentially, that may be a possibility to be able to open up that piece of property and develop it a little bit more. And I know JR might be able to speak that a little bit more, but I think that was maybe his idea. But I think it's a great, in a different way to look at how we can manage our properties. And yeah.
Well, yeah, whether it's this property, I do think that is kind of the model, like the Salmonberry Trail, right? So there's that a bunch of agencies and or entities are partnering in kind of with some promise of nonprofit entities stepping forward and doing some of the work. So I do think there are some models of that where it's maybe outside the realm of like, one entity, just because that's so multi-jurisdictional, one entity has not taken it on. But but trying to get that nonprofit to step up and take it on. And then that's what we've talked about with some property is, do we partner with development of some parklands if we had some guarantees from a nonprofit to help operate and that to realize a funding stream on the Salmon Berry or something to that effect. So I do think it's something we're looking at actively, but I don't know that we've done that. I don't know that I can think of a specific example where we've done it purely, especially from okay, yes, we will acquire it under that promise. I've not seen that, other than some of those linear trail properties, the OC&E down in Klamath County.
The OC&E Sandberry.
Yeah.
Part of that acquisition in the 90s was under the promise that several other entities, Forest Service, a nonprofit trail group, and etc. I think there was like 6 signatories on that agreement, would all help manage and move that trail forward. I don't know that it's a case study in success because all those entities dropped out of that agreement and it's now just a state park asset. But we do have a volunteer group that does still have some activity on there, but I don't think quite to the point of what was initially visioned when we took on that property.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner,
Matt. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Commissioner Blasher, I think you were next with your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, I got school got canceled early and kiddos are here running around having themselves a snow day, no after school program. So a bit distracted. And, yeah, so just a few thoughts, specifically on leverage. And again, maybe this is already mentioned, but I missed it in my distraction. But in some ways, I think leverage kind of fits into that category in some ways of strategic return on investment, right? Because if you're able to leverage your investments, then that's potentially a better return. So, and as I look through the list, it's like, instead of going one by one, I just pulled up what you sent us before with the all 11 criteria. And I think we started this conversation of what's criteria, what's consideration, what's a guiding principle. And there might be some ways to like nest some of these criteria into some of the main themes, right? Because ultimately it comes down to like, does it fit with our mission? What are the financial or resource cost considerations that go into the acquisition itself? What's the interest in long-term, planning? Like, how does this fit into that? So there might be some ways to turn this from 11 criteria into 5 or 6 more key things that then have a few, some of these concepts listed in there. Because I think the question too is, sorry, I'm a little all over the place, but when we think of this list, how is it we as commissioners can be the most helpful in setting clarity of policy expectations so that is a usable staff tool, right? Because hopefully we're not coming back to this very often. So if you're like, hey, this is great, we like having 11 criteria and kind of this different range and some overlap, that's working for us, then cool, we don't need to tinker with it. But if you are looking for the commission to help set a little bit, a different way to have it, either a tighter condensing of things or a different way that, or maybe this is partially an external communication thing too, so that people know as they're making requests for disposition or acquisition that they know, hey, here's the high level criteria that should be out there. So those are just some thoughts and comments in this overall process, and really glad we're having this conversation. Glad we didn't try to drive around and get everywhere. I'll put a picture up of what Lewis and Clark State Park looks like right now. So
it was
thank
beautiful though. Glad the boys are home.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think that's really good input. And I purposefully didn't want to come and say, so here's what I think we should do. I wanted to help kind of walk through this and get your input. In my mind, I do think ending up kind of where what you just described is the best route, which is we have less criteria and then we have some of these considerations, things to think about on the side as we go through. But the criteria that are really in statute and rule are kind of what govern exactly how we can do it. And then the other things I think fall into that consideration category. And to one of your other points of whether this is an internal facing or external facing, it's both. So when somebody does come to us with a piece of property that they think we might be interested in, as JR mentioned earlier, we'll hand them the form that's the parkland nomination form. It has these criteria included because it sometimes, best case scenario, if it's a piece of property that really probably wouldn't fit into the system, they can fill out that form and come to that conclusion kind of on their own. I would say that the same thing is true internally. Sometimes we'll think, gosh, this is a great piece of property. I think we should buy it. We go through that process. It's like, yeah, maybe not. So, yeah. Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, so I was kind of wrestling with this because I think of properties that we've acquired through these kinds of extra money that we probably wouldn't have had on our list had it not been, not essentially free, but they came with a load. Sitka Sedge, we ended up getting, and then it turns around, we have to now put in a whole water floodgate and a bunch of different things that the feds were trying to pawn off on somebody, and we ended up owning that. And then the other one is when we're working with a lot of the local land trusts or nonprofits like Wetlands Conservancy and some of those, sometimes because they want us to have a piece of property isn't necessarily something that we should have. We have a couple of pieces that are now endangered species properties where they want to limit public access, and we're a public access agency. So it creates a hardship for us to keep people out of locations for murrelet nesting and some of those kinds of things when we have our own set of locations that we're needing to manage. And so sometimes free isn't free, and sometimes doing
Never free.
and when we're doing the bidding of a nonprofit rather than our own mission, then we're kind of selling out. And so I like the idea of this being consideration, because the consideration is, yeah, great, there's some money and it comes with this property, we want it, or no, we don't, regardless of the money.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, well said. Commissioner Dewar.
Hi there. I've had my hand up off and on, and then my fellow commissioners go and say insightful things that basically cover what I wanted to say. So you've noticed probably my hand going up and down a few times. Very good discussion. I appreciate it. And in some ways, what Dennis just mentioned aligns well with, I guess, the one remaining thought on my mind on this particular point, and that is, especially prior to becoming a commissioner, I worked quite a bit with other state agencies where there were huge mitigation needs. And it was interesting that at certain times, the ways that those have been handled are very siloed within the individual agencies. I think of the fish, wildlife, wetland, and other mitigation responsibilities of ODOT, for example, which are substantial, and DSL with, for example, their payment in lieu program for wetlands. And in some cases, of course, those properties that we are looking at have some of the attributes that align with those other state agencies' objectives in terms of mitigation requirements. But also this invites a range of possible burdens and complexities. I appreciate that. And I've always had the impression that siloing was changing, that was evolving a little bit. There was a greater coordination between agencies. I guess I'd like to that we could probably fill up a whole session on that very topic, and I don't want to do that because this is kind of a minor point. But I agree that this reference to additional funds, grants, donations, it's not so much criteria language, but these are conditions that can exist within the range of possibilities. So we don't want to close the door on these things happening, but we always have to invite kind of a judicious assessment of whether it's in State Park's best interests to do this. But I'm wondering if you can speak just very briefly, Matt, to summarize in maybe 3 sentences the history of what's going on there in terms of the relationship between OPRD and those other agencies in terms of collaborative efforts to sort of channel their considerable resources, sometimes that might be available for these things, whether that has evolved, whether that's just a blind alley, or if you see possibilities there. My hope is that we could write the language here so that the door is also technically open to that, but not wide open to that we have some reasonable mechanism where we can assess whether it's an OPRD's best interests to engage with those other agencies, and sometimes tap into those considerable resources if there is an alignment of interests that makes sense and makes sense sort of long term. So I'll stop talking and see what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. That's a great point. And as you were describing that, there are a couple of examples I can give you in the back of my mind that I think show progress to that end. The first is there was some headway made pre-pandemic. Tabitha had been working with ODOT to try and right size the property that may have been parceled off to parks when we separated from ODOT, and then also some property that should have stayed with ODOT, you know, and so trying to right size that, working internally to make sure that the properties that we have fit within our mission and the properties that they have fit within theirs. Another example of one that we were working on, I think we're just picking this one back up. This was a pre-pandemic, is some work over in Northeast Oregon with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have a couple of pieces of property that we're looking to swap with them for a piece of ours. So that just to go a little bit further down that road, the Ukiah Dale State Scenic Corridor abuts the Bridge Creek Wildlife Area. So it abuts Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife property. We weren't particularly managing that piece of property, and it fits in with the management that they're doing of that wildlife area. They in turn have a couple of campgrounds down near Troy, at the confluence of the Wanaha and the Grand Ronde River that fit better into how we manage properties. And so I think there'll be more to that exchange, but that's kind of the basis of it. So are we doing that as widespread as we could be? Probably not. I think the conversation with ODOT, we will be. And I think the one with ODF&W is going to probably open up some new possibilities. So it's a great point. And I'm wondering, I'm pausing because I'm wondering, could that or should that maybe go into one of the considerations? Maybe not necessarily a criteria, but more of a consideration. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's good. And some of those examples you mentioned are ones that come to my mind as well as in terms of cooperation over the last few years. I see what looks like superficially, without getting down into the details, what look like good opportunities for those kinds of collaborations to really support the broader state mission across multiple agencies. And so I agree, though, not so much criteria, but again, conditions that could exist. And they kind of fall under this heading, but they're categorically a bit different than this concept of external funding through grants and donations. But it's another door we want to not necessarily close completely, but not throw widely open either. So anyway, some language that captures that and allows us to identify those opportunities, make the most of them when they exist and when they look good for the long-term value of OPRD. So good return on investment and all that good stuff. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I did not keep it even anywhere close to 3 sentences either. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Very good. Thanks.
Okay. Before we move on to the next criteria, any other kind of follow-up with the leverage one? Really good discussion. That's why I apologize for the first couple, because like I said, they're pretty tightly wrapped in statute and rule, but these are a little more open for this kind of a discussion. I think the next one actually goes back to being very rule and statutory heavy. So the next one is buffer, and this language is pulled verbatim from rule. Provide buffer to adjacent or nearby development that may diminish the recreation or conservation values of existing park property.
I'll give it it's fine.
You
did all right.
on that one?
Okay.
We keep going. All right.
I'll bring you that receipt.
I can anticipate that this one is going to create some pretty good dialogue. This one,
Because we don't have any parks in Hardy County.
Write that down, somebody, put that in the minutes.
Yeah, but there's less than 1,000 population in Harney County.
And we have a whole bunch of cars.
We don't have electric cars either, we don't need charging stations.
One's a little bit tricky, because again, similar to a couple of the ones we just talked about, there's not a good, kind of solid definition in rule or statute around what is meant by geographic distribution. One of the things that I want to point out that I think may be an avenue for where this criteria goes in the future is in the intro of the rule, it talks about establishing, maintaining a list of properties and areas of interest. The way we've looked at it in the past is you can see based on the definition of that geographic distribution, 25 acres of state park land per 1,000 population in each county. We've looked at it very specific to a county, and I'm going to pull up a map here in a second that shows you where we're at with that and what it would mean if we actually met that criteria. But I'd like us to think about areas of interest versus specific to a county. So whether that area of interest be the coast or Southeast Oregon or, whatever it happens to be, I think in my mind, that would open up a little bit more realistic and probably, just a better served criteria. As you can see down in that next OAR there, again, it mentions geographic distribution, but it doesn't give us kind of any parameters around what that means. In statute, it talks about satisfying the need for overnight and large group use facilities on the perimeter of urban population centers. And then one of the agency's key performance measures is there at the bottom too. And I know that that's something that the agency is actively trying to get adjusted because it's not a good key performance measure. That just, in my mind, tells us to go out and buy property, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the quality of that property or whether there's community support for that property.
I mean, we could just go buy junk property and meet it.
Right. Yes. So
I have no way of raising my hand.
Hold on, Commissioner Grassi has something to say.
Commissioner Grassi, yeah.
Well, I do have a comment, but before I get too far, I gotta tell you that many of us in this room are being distracted by Liz and Clara and wanting a closer look. But with
Sorry.
that said.
She's still asleep though, so.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, she looks so snuggly.
So,
She's wearing her sweater that grandma made her, so she's nice and cozy.
Aw.
very nice.
Remember those days, Jonathan?
Here's a better view of her.
Thank you. So that criteria is simply horrible.
Thank you.
I think we gotta figure out a way to change it. That either stymies any potential or puts us under the gun so bad at both ends of it. It's just horrible. So I hope we can do something with that.
Hopefully we don't use it.
So this is a map that Tabitha put together that shows what that would look like in real life. So you could, the areas that have the yellow tags with the counties are the areas that we don't have 25 acres per 1,000 and what it would take to get there. Again, this is kind of just hitting home, Commissioner Grassley, what you just said. So we'd have to purchase another 16,500 acres in Multnomah County, 13,000 in Washington County, right?
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah. And so
What's our budget?
I added this up total now. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but I want to say it was somewhere between 50 and 60,000 acres additional property that we would need to purchase to meet that criteria. And again, it's not meaningful. Those wouldn't necessarily be meaningful acquisitions. They would just be acquisitions, which we, one, don't have the funding to acquire, and two, probably don't have the funding to maintain over the long term. So, so I thought this would be a good one for us to talk through, and
What's with Malheur County and nothing?
so
It's
We
meeting the
own enough.
criteria now?
We own enough.
we
property
own
that
enough there. Yep. Anything that,
Yeah.
any of those that don't have the yellow, we're at or above that 25 acres per 1,000 population. Again, not that I'm convinced that's a sensible measurement, but that's just where we're at. So, and the team can go back and we can draft up some kind of additional language, potentially around geographic areas, you know, the coast, Eastern Oregon, whatever that happens to be, and bring that back to the April meeting. But I just, this is one I figured we'd have pretty good discussion around. Commissioner Allen.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm not offering any specific language, but just picking up on what you said, I think whatever is useful for you all, going back to Jonathan's comment earlier, which I think was excellent, I think is important to keep in mind. But if it's just thinking about what is it that we're trying to get at with this consideration, access, serving this a statewide lens, you know, so thinking about the meaningful outcome one is hoping to have in thinking about geographic distribution, I think, you know, to me would be most important, as opposed to let's count the right beans, you know.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Blasher.
Yeah, I agree with Jennifer, and I don't have anything of real substance to offer, just that I think clearly it's important. I don't know if this is like, again, geographic distribution or geographic representation. I think that you all could probably think of some smarter ways to get to measuring the overall intent and impact, which is, you know, folks from all across the state, if they want to go to a state park, should be able to relatively easy. Because I think there's also something that goes in with this number 6 geographic representation that goes in with number 9 popular initiative. And I'm sorry, I keep jumping around, but like I have to look at the whole big thing, because if we're not wanted, then we don't want to push too hard. At the same time, if people haven't had a chance to experience all the splendor of state park staff and services, maybe they don't know. So is it if you build it, they will come? But I think, again, it's one of those that's not necessarily if then, but it's also and this, and I don't know, there's just other considerations there, I think, that go into it. So yeah, I think those are my thought there. It's like that geographic representation. And then I guess aligned with that too, I don't know if this is quite in here with the mission impact and things, but are there like scenic, natural resources and experiences that we want to make sure are in the portfolio, right? There's only one Smith Rock, but you know, do you need to have a Smith Rock everywhere around the state or some type of experience? And so I wonder too, if there's those, yeah, like what are those experiences that you know, that people want to be able to have, and like, hey, it'd be great to not, I mean, the coast is where the coast is. We can't change that. But if there's other types of features, like we kind of deal with this in the metro region with some of our things where people are like, hey, how come this property isn't fully designed as a nature park? And we say, well, there's a nature park, you know, maybe 10, 15 miles down this way that has almost the exact same type of scenic experience. So there might be some places too to play around with the, I don't know, the geographic, not just location, but the types of experiences that we want to make sure are accessible. And to Commissioner Grasty's point too, I think you raised earlier, of how we combine with other jurisdictions. Are there other coverage that's happening in Harney County or somewhere else? It's like, hey, you might not be getting the state parks experience, but through BLM, ODFW, or some other public agency, you are getting a park nature experience through some other sister partner agency. So thanks.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And going back to, is this criteria in kind of conflict with others? And I totally think it is. Two of the notes I made is the strategic investment, right? So if we're going out and purchasing properties based on just the geographic distribution, we're probably not being, good stewards of the funds, but also that community impact. And you mentioned that, Commissioner Blashers, if we're going out getting 25 acres per 1,000 population in a community that doesn't want us, that's probably not the right path forward.
Got plenty of those.
We do. And another thing you mentioned, and this is something I was thinking about as I was putting this together, which is the experience that we want, the experiences we want to provide. And I wonder if there's a way that rather than geographic distribution, can we look at our park classification system and make sure that that is spread out equitably or at least intentionally kind of across the state rather than just looking at having an Oregon State Park property? Because that, I think, to your point, gets more at providing the experience rather than just a state park. So, and then lastly, sorry, I wanted to also touch on this idea of connecting to other agencies. I wish I would have grabbed these stats, but as you look, especially on the eastern side of the state, but even on like Tillamook counties this way, I think Lynn County, some of the other counties, the amount of public property, public acreage in some of those counties is upwards of 75%, somewhere between 50 and 75%. And so, yes, actually, Harney County is 75%. I do remember that one. But I do think that has to drive part of our decision making too, in terms of where we identify and what kind of properties we identify in some of those counties too. So I'll stop there, but thank you. Yeah, Commissioner Grassley.
So perhaps this isn't entirely related to the acquisition criteria, but sometimes, while I'm very proud to be a commission member of Oregon State Parks Department, I also got to think at times, maybe we need more of a focus on parks, just that, because in many areas of the state, perhaps it's Portland City Parks or it's BLM or Forest Service. I finally figured out where the camera is. Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah. That's a conversation for another day, but how do we promote just that single word, parks, and not simply Oregon Parks? I said to our director the other day that Oregon Parks in Harney County is a couple of very tiny islands in a sea of public lands. And I don't know how we do that, but Oregon Parks doesn't need to throw more money at it if there's plenty of parks. But then how do we say that there's a park and most people just see parks.
They don't know the difference.
They don't know
Nor
the
should
difference.
Yeah.
They don't know if they're on a county road or a state highway either.
Nope.
I mean, it's just the way it works.
Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And, one of the properties that I forgot to mention as I was talking about the exchange with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife that I'm hoping will be part of that package is Fish Lake down in the Steens there. So that would give a little bit different flavor of Oregon State Parks in Harney County.
You gotta tell me what someday.
Okay, there's no promise that that's going to happen, but I sure hope it does. We're trying. Anyways, Dennis, sorry.
Yeah, so in the past, we've talked a lot about that seamless service delivery where we're working closely with county and city parks as well and federal parks. And I think using the Office of Outdoor Recreation might be a vehicle to actually start marrying all of that together for the public consumption. The other thing to consider, I think in considerations rather than acquisition criteria, is just using the SCORP plan. So the public involvement process every 5 years, defining where in the state they'd like to see acquisition or development should be one of the main things we look at, because we're actually serving that greater public. And so trying to meet their needs while we're doing our own internal administrative decision making. I think the public has a huge vote in this.
Which would also get to Commissioner Blasher's point about what's missing from the system, right? Like, what do people want? What's the future asking for? So then how do we figure out, not just geographically, but recreationally, how are we making sure we're being diverse and relevant?
So it's a great point, Dennis, and I'm glad you brought that up. There are, in my mind, a couple of criteria or considerations missing, and one of them, we'll get to it at the end. I've got a couple of slides that are just some thoughts on what those might be, but one of them, and it talks about it in the rule, which is diversity of values. And really that information, I think we can get out of the score to help us identify what that kind of means for this system. And again, whether that's a consideration or a criteria, I don't know. I think we need to work that out a little bit more, but it's a great point. So we'll plan on bringing back some adjusted language for this one at the next meeting. I really appreciate the input. I figured this one was going to create some good discussion. So thank you. Anything before we move on to the next one? All right.
You know where it came from?
Which one?
That criteria 25 acres.
So back when the Oregon Progress Board, is that what that was
Oh my
called?
God.
Yeah, everything had to have a metric.
We had
You to-
metrics and it came from that metric.
You have to have metrics so you can measure and say you have.
And we've just never been able to propose something different that would be better, that we could continually measure, that stays
We have
relevant.
to figure something different.
Yeah.
It's so limited on one
And it's
end,
kind of weird
so-
because the KPM is 35 acres, but the rule is 25 acres per thousand. And so we've always wondered where the difference be if somebody transposed the number. I don't know, but it's 25 and 35 out of 1,000. And it's way back in that day.
I actually wish somebody go back and
Demolish
run
all
the
of that.
numbers on the progress board. Those 93 criteria. It'd be interesting to see them today, but they're a whole other.
We do it every legislative session.
I think there'll be a lot of excitement that we get to adjust this one.
Get rid of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The next one is feasible, and that has been defined as probability of successful acquisition with minimal risk. I think this one, we probably will have some good discussion around too, and I think in my mind can be adjusted. When you look at the language there, highlighted, underlined and bolded, in the rule, it talks about the overall feasibility to become a state park. Whereas the definition that we have currently as part of the acquisition criteria talks about is it going to be a successful acquisition with minimal risk?
That's the.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The OAR says feasibility, and basically what this is their definition of what feasibility means. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yes, and so I think
That's how that came to be, isn't it, Matt? The OAR had that word feasibility in it, and somebody scratched their head and said, well, what does that mean? Let's stick it up here as meaning this.
and I don't know exactly, and Alice or Tabitha might have a better sense of kind of how it came to be.
I don't really, Matt, I don't really care.
Something he's proposing.
That feasible probability of successful, that's the current criteria. So he's trying to show you those
Okay.
OARs are probably where it came from.
That's where it came from, and what's all I'm saying, Steve, is that because it's in the OAR, the rule, they felt the need to address it
And
as,
make it criteria.
to make it a criteria. So they decided that that's how they would make it a criteria, is defining the word feasibility as probability of successful acquisition with minimal risk.
And
Maybe that's
loaded.
how you define feasibility, but that may not be how,
Right.
it's almost nonsensical, Matt,
Right.
and I don't, good luck, but it needs fixing. Oh, boy.
Okay.
That's not feasibility as defined in criteria speak, I guess.
So was the result of today's conversation going to be rulemaking and changing some of these rules?
No, it's gonna be having our criteria align with what we want, not necessarily a word that was in an OAR.
But we wrote
Exactly.
the OAR for ourselves.
Correct.
And so there's no conversation here about we're gonna at some point.
We
go
could.
and
We
roll.
could,
We
we
could.
could,
Yeah,
but
we could, and I think to your question, Commissioner Grassley, I think because some of these terms are well-defined, those are the ones that are pretty, that we've kind of just glossed over, like the buffer one we just went through. The ones that weren't well-defined for us, and we've kind of done our own interpretation of those are the ones that I think we're having the kind of more robust discussion around to be able to define it for the next, however long, for us to work on that interpretation. I think this one, in my mind, I like the idea of having something around, mitigating risk or minimal risk, but I think that in my mind, that's covered in a couple of the other criteria that we talked to. One we'll talk about here shortly, which is the community impact. So does it have support from a community? Does it, because generally speaking, that's where I think we've run into some struggles in the past, is when we don't have that local support and the risk that creates. But I also think, depending on where we land with that strategic investment criteria, I think that's the other piece of it, is if we know that we're committed to funding the property, funding the operation, the maintenance, I think that's another area where we mitigate that kind of a risk. And so the probability of a successful acquisition itself, I think, also goes back to, do we have support? Generally, when we have support and we have the funding and we know long-term that we're going to be able to manage that property, then it's a successful acquisition. Alice, I see you're unmuted. Do you have additional information?
Well, part of that feasibility, if I'm remembering back when we were putting this together years ago, was, and where I've seen us use this before, is when we have outside entities encouraging us to put in a park or buy a piece of property. They think it would make the best park in the world. And they know nothing about the seller or any past history we may have there. So that's where feasibility would come into play, that it isn't feasible for us to buy it right now. But the way the OAR is written, it's speaking to it as its feasibility as a state park.
Right.
And to me, that's something a little different than successful acquisition with a minimal risk. We're talking two different things there.
So I think to your point, Commissioner Grassley, so yes, we could change the rules, but the rule itself isn't horrible.
No.
But I don't know that we have to have a criteria for this particular rule. It would be in the considerations of whether or not we were going to make the acquisition, and that the feasibility of whether or not it would be a successful state park should be in every real estate transaction we have. And having it just say
that's the mission piece.
Right.
That's the.
But if we thought the rules were not meeting our current need, we could certainly rewrite rules. Katie's great at rule making. She's getting kind of bored.
It is kind of what I'm struggling with, is the chicken or the egg, with the chicken being the rule. I wasn't sure which one you're gonna change to have the outcome that allows us the most flexibility but drives good decision.
So in this particular one, we feel pretty good with the rules. We're just trying to make sure that the process is flexible and clear enough to meet the intent of the rules.
Yeah. Yep.
Or
And then once we get through with process, it may be that you all are like, hey, a couple of those rules need to get tweaked or deleted or rewritten or something like that. But I think right now the rules are okay.
Yeah.
It's the way that somebody has interpreted the rules to create the procedure of how we move forward. And that's not, the clarity isn't clear enough for us there.
Yes, that's exactly. Thanks, Lisa.
I never want to be where our rules are used against us.
Right.
We wrote the rules, they need to be
And in
ones
some of
we can work
this,
with the best.
we've kind of created the ability for them to use our rules against us. This one in particular.
That's what it looks
A
like.
successful acquisition could be you go buy a blank lot here in Salem
Yeah.
downtown, and it has no ability ever to be a state park, but it would be minimal risk. The acquisition is easy.
It's a city park, you can have that.
No.
I like what Alice said, it's a feasibility as a state
As a
park.
state park.
And that's a different meaning than feasibility to me.
Feasibility, yeah.
So the rule's good,
Yes.
but our definition of
We can have-
criteria is horrible.
We can have people donate property to us every day, but that doesn't mean we want it.
Right.
So
Shipsy Shores.
Gypsy Soars.
Okay, that's helpful. I do think for both definitions here of feasible, whether that's the current criteria or how it's stated in rule, I think the other criteria that we have pretty much answer both of those.
Yeah.
Okay,
One less criteria.
yes.
So what we're doing, are we actually striking that out
You're
then?
gonna take it out,
Yeah,
because you still have the rule to fall back onto,
yeah, sure.
so it'd be a consideration.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that one before we move on?
Which one are we on, Matt? How many we got to go?
They're getting tired.
Let me see
I'm
here.
gonna have to
There's
stand
4
up.
left.
Do we want to take a break?
Yeah.
No, well,
No, they'd rather power through. Let's
they'd
go
rather
fast.
power through, but I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna take a break.
And if-
Okay, never mind, we're taking a break. I
No,
thought
no,
she didn't want
you
to.
can power through
Okay.
without me. You keep going. I'm just gonna take a look.
Nice to stand up once in a while. I got my 10,000 steps in this morning, thanks to our director.
We walked to the Capitol and then toured.
So, the good news is we have, well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 left, I think, and they're all pretty darn straightforward. I mean, they're all basically verbatim from statute and rules. So I think we can get through these quite quickly. So this one's compelling opportunity. And again, this is kind of that one that's really the sense of urgency. It's both in statute and rule. Again, I just don't think that there's much flexibility on this one, and I don't think we want much flexibility on it because you know, this is kind of that strike while the iron's hot idea. Any thoughts on that one before we jump to the next? And I don't want to rush through these. If we need to put some of these off for more discussion at the next meeting, I'm totally fine with that too. I don't want to not get into it.
So Matt, this would be like, we've identified if there's any less pieces of acreage along the Oregon coast that we don't currently own, this would be where we would use that criteria to say it may not ever be a state park, but we would want it in our holding just so that we control that portion of the ocean shore, right?
Yes, yeah.
So might there be a time when, there, I don't know, there's some historic site that was gonna go into private ownership?
That we may want
That
to
would
jump on.
be,
Yep,
when it's, okay, thanks.
something that was more critical to mission.
I think a good example of this is the gift shop up at Otter Crest.
Yeah.
That was a privately owned business, but yet state parks own the parking lot and all the land around.
The gift shop at Watercrest.
100-year-old stone gift shop perched above the ocean. And so it had never been for sale. And so when it came up for sale, we had a fairly tight window to either acquire it before they sold it on the open market. And so we did. So I think it's definitely those unique opportunities come up every once in a while.
Yeah, I think a real recent one, that's a great example. A real recent one was Gleason Park in John Day, the city park property there. That was another one that, you know, the concern, if we wouldn't have been able to jump on that as quickly as we did, I know that the city had other ideas for sure, especially with the changing city council and all those different things. We really had to jump on that one quickly. Commissioner Blasher.
Yeah, I guess my only comment would be that I definitely agree with the criteria. We just might need to change it, the name of it, because all of this is compelling, right? That's the whole idea, is that everything on this list is compelling. So I think if you change it to say an urgent opportunity, this is about a time-bound opportunity that, yeah, that's the way I read this. And so I guess that would be my comment, is because this is about, yeah, an urgent opportunity rather than compelling. So
Great, thank you. Lisa, is your hand up?
I think it's Commissioner Grasty's.
Oh, sorry. Commissioner Grasty.
Whatever Jonathan said made me space out what I was thinking, so he must have been right.
Carry on.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe what I said was so off topic. You're like lost now.
He had a big smile when you were talking,
Yeah.
so it must have fixed it.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Okay, the next one, again, these next couple are pretty quick because they are essentially verbatim from rule. So this one, popular initiative, public demand, investment for future growth legislation. So as part of the rule, it talks about acquiring properties specifically directed by the legislature.
That's a good one.
And then under the rule that has some of the criteria for acquisition, it talks about public demand. So I guess there is some flexibility in this because there's the piece in there that talks about investment for future growth. So we probably could adjust that one a bit. Commissioner Allen.
Yeah, I'm looking for when the staff will come to us and say, hi, we have a really unpopular initiative that we'd like you to consider.
How long do you have?
I'd like to propose we buy Idaho.
Commissioner Blaster.
Thanks. Yeah, I would offer on this one too, like public demand is one that can be such a broad term that like what hits that threshold? Is it the number of people, going back to like the geographic distribution, is about the number of people in the county that say this, that, the other? Unfortunately, we know that a lot of the way the politics in our country and region and state work is sometimes it's a few voices that get to the right people that push for something. And so that's not necessarily public demand. And I guess going back to, I think it was Dennis was mentioning SCORP. This might be a place to sort of say, hey, based on regular, analysis and outreach, these are the types of things. So it's like just defining public demand a little bit more. Okay. And then I'll also say on the other side, I think there's like studies and things that have shown that we as the public, we don't really know what we want. Like, I don't necessarily know what I want as a consumer until someone shows me, hey, here's an iPhone. Here's that thing you never, ever asked for. Now you can't live without it. Similar with some of our park amenities, or people say, hey, I want this thing. Like, how many horseshoe rings do we have in our parks that I never see anybody use? And maybe I'm in the wrong part of the state. So I think also like being clear of, pickleball is really big right now, but I don't know if pickleball is going to be big, when my kids are, in 20 years. And so I think we have to find a way to sort of balance what are like current trends and priorities that we could actually meet within some sort of window. And again, SCORP might be that place to call it out as, here's how we're going to do our best to match these things that we think people will need, but also not to like, Commissioner Grassie's point, have some language that could be used against us. And someone says, hey, here's this public demand, go do this thing. So those are my comments on that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I would also say that the legislation piece is a given.
Do we have to have that in rule?
Well, it's a given.
If it happens, we have no choice.
It's a given in that it's an acquisition. It trumps all of them, unfortunately. Putting it in there almost invites somebody to do it.
See, that was my point.
Leaving that language out makes it easier for you to say, well, it's not in our criteria. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I
I would
think
have said this a few years ago.
Hey, I would have. I would have. Let me tell you, so many things they were messing in that we shouldn't have been messing. Yeah, and this is one I'd like to see that word get out of there. Just because it gives them permission.
Yeah.
All right, mic drop.
We're stuck when it comes. I mean,
But we could go to them and say, well, gee, we'd like to, but it isn't in our criteria.
I can tell you who testified to that. She would.
You get to deliver
I do that. I do it in a heartbeat.
But I'm just curious why we even put it in there. Maybe Katie's point was maybe we just wanted to like have to let it sit in with us that it's a reality, but it's a reality no matter what, and calling it out isn't super helpful. I mean, it would have been really nice last week while we were sitting in a certain legislator's office to say, Well, that's neat, but it's not one of our 19 criteria.
I'll
Although
say
it
it,
would have been
I'll say it in
invited,
testimony, just try me.
He would have added it. He would have added to
Yeah,
our
yeah.
criteria.
It might have something to do and maybe when this OAR was amended the last time. And
Do you know when that was, Alice?
that's what I was just trying to look up and I'm not seeing it right in front of me. I
I
apologize.
just wonder if it came after the Park of Years stuff when Schrader.
That's
was
what
sitting-
I was thinking parking year, and wasn't there a property that we kind of got instructed to buy?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
so I think that's might be when this came about. I want to say this OAR was done while
The only time we ever.
shortly after you and I got here.
So if you're looking at history, Jonathan, pickleball was invented in 1965 and I played it in college 40 years ago. So it's here to stay.
I was talking to somebody about it. I learned how to play it in middle school and I thought it was just a joke, a thing that was just some Eugene, like kind of hippy dippy game because I had never seen it anywhere in my entire life. And now it's come back with a vengeance. And
Yeah, when you hit 65, you'll be a pro.
I
Yeah,
will.
well,
Yeah.
When you hit 65, there's very few games left, Jonathan. And so that stupid wiffle ball looks pretty good to you.
Hey, I play wiffle ball with my kids, so I'm ready to go right now.
It's not a big thing in Harney County.
No, I'm sure in Harvey County, they have things to do with their time.
Well, we'll take this one back and rework it. I think we will pull that legislative piece out and maybe redefine better the public demand with language from SCORP or something like that. I've got some ideas. Okay, anything else on this one before we jump to the next one? All right, this one is long-range planning, consistent with acquisition priorities stated within a park master plan or other adopted plan by the Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission. Again, this one is pulled maybe not verbatim, but pretty close to verbatim from rule. You can see here talks about consider park master plans. And up here at the top shall be consistent with the department's purpose and long-range planning goals. Thoughts on that one?
So
It's
does
one
that,
of many.
does that ever conflict with the immediate opportunity? Yeah, and what do you do about that when it does?
Well, so it's a great question, and Alice and Tabitha could probably speak to this better than I can, but I know, sometimes our, say, a master plan is 20 or 30 years old, and so in those plans, new acquisitions weren't necessarily identified in those. So far, and again, Alice and Tabitha, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that that's prohibited us from purchasing a piece of property, but it can cause a little bit of, I guess just more conversation. And but I don't think it's actually stopped us from it. The problem is, well, and actually there's language, I don't know if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, there was language in there in rule that says, even if a piece of property is not on a list, we can still go after it. So it is in rule that way. This just prioritizes some of that. I'll let Alice talk a little bit more about it.
Well, we stopped, I recall us stopping specifically identifying a piece of property in the master plans and pointing a finger at it unless it was so significant to us that they stopped. It was, the master plans were worded in such a way in the last ones that they were doing that if we could get more property in this area for this purpose, good kind of thing, where like the Smith Rock property you mentioned earlier, that's more than 20 years ago, it was spelled out specifically this piece of property, and so the family came to us because you identified it in your plan that you wanted it. And I recall when we were doing, and Dennis Comfort might remember this too, when we were doing the master planning around the Brian Booth area.
Mhm.
We were trying to avoid pointing fingers at specific properties because, again, it hurts negotiations for one thing. And there were some parties who didn't want their property identified specifically
Yeah.
because of the pressure they get from their neighbors and such.
Yeah.
So,
I think
does that
we may
make any sense?
we may retool this one a little bit. I'm gonna make a quick note here.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the whole thing means.
I have a question. Do you see any benefit from this, possibly reworded or whatever, if one takes things into account like climate change, where we might say it's not just the immediate value, it's potentially the longer term value. So I just wonder if it gives leverage for saying, we're weighing this and maybe looking at it in the next 5 years, the benefit to the system is X, but looking at it over 75 years, the benefit is X to the nth degree. So I'm just wondering if that gives staff anything to work with there.
Commissioner Allen, that's a great point. And one of I mentioned earlier, talking about what criteria could be missing, and climate adaptation is one of those. And I wonder if rather than having it as its own separate criteria, which is, you'll see, I've got that on a slide here in a couple of slides down the road, but I wonder if incorporating that into this might be a better way to go. I like that.
One could do it as an example, like
Yeah.
one could say longer term considerations such as, and then that doesn't restrict you to that, because who knows what's coming at us, right?
Right. Yep. No, I really like that.
Yeah, I was going to chime in and say and agree with that as well. It's like, I think especially as this talks about other adopted plans. So if we had a climate resiliency strategy, that could be an adopted plan, and then that would support as properties came available, in line with identified areas where we're retreating or adapting use or whatever. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. Any other thoughts on that one before we move on? There's only one more.
I guess the only thing I would add is kind of getting back to that that question of connectivity with other jurisdictions and other departments and agencies. Are there other long-range plans? Like, is there some other statewide long-range plan, goal 5 type stuff or whatever that we would want to plug into? Because I really appreciated the materials you sent out a few weeks back that showed the ownership and sort of priorities of the other departments. It was really interesting to see DSL and ODFW and Oregon Forestry. It was just it was really good context, and it's interesting to say, hey, where can we help as part of that? And maybe it's, I don't know, there might be some other statewide efforts that we could plug into. I realize that gets into a dangerous game of, getting outside of our jurisdiction or our reach, but at least that consideration when it comes to that. And I also want to just double down on what Jennifer was saying about like climate resilience and just thinking of those longer term opportunities, because this might be a place too to again identify define long range planning. Is it a 20-year master plan, or is it multiple generations, the like 7 generations type, 70-year, 150-year outlook, which is difficult to do. But I feel like we do some of that on the Rocky Shores management. It's like definitely much longer term range that we seem to be looking there. So thanks.
No, thank you. It's interesting, and I'm not sure how we would pull this off, but the state of Washington, for their natural resource agencies, so they have a DNR, which is their forestry, they have a fish and wildlife, and they have parks. And then they have like a conservation commission kind of. They're all separate entities, but that conservation commission actually pulled together a strategic acquisition plan for the state of Washington as a whole, natural resource related. And I wonder if, and maybe I guess we'll talk more about that, but but what you just described reminds me of that, and it seems like a pretty neat coordinated effort so that, yeah, whether it's recreation properties or just, conservation properties, whatever it might be, we're on the same page. The other thing that I think that might help with is when we're, say, contacted by a nonprofit or a private citizen with a piece of property that doesn't necessarily fit our mission, we could tie them in with ODF&W or ODF or ODOT or whoever it might be. So, yeah, I'm gonna look more into that. Thank you. Hey, Chrissy.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I wanted to just reiterate that through that historic properties acquisition lens that, sometimes when we're looking at historic properties, there is an urgency piece to it. And, I know Jonathan and I have had multiple conversations about the Bybee Howell House, and also there's a property in Portland called Alpenrose, which is the last 52-acre dairy in the middle of Southwest Portland. And sometimes you don't even know that another agency or system may be looking for an acquisition in that particular area. So that is super important for historic properties because it takes a specialized sort of filter to look at properties like that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great idea. Commissioner Dewar. Oh.
Because in this virtual format, it's hard for people to see you nodding in agreement. I just thought I'd chime in. I've been doing a lot of nodding here in my own home office. And I really like some of what was being said by Commissioner Allen and Commissioner Blasher about thinking about the long range planning goals and to some extent trying to anticipate what those long-term challenges will be. And especially Jonathan's point about these acquisition discussions actually helping drive some of this long-term visioning essentially within OPRD. That seems consequential. I know that a lot of us have talked internally about the fate of the coastal parks with accelerated erosion and the need to sort of march a little bit eastward for a few of them for long-term protection. There have been parallel conversations about fire frequency and the implications of that for management and fire management, resource management, and so on, some of which may actually have some bearing on acquisition decisions and so on. So I think that I agree with the comment that Jonathan made about just to some extent this helps drive some of those conversations about long range planning and trying to continue to integrate the acquisition discussion, the acquisition criteria discussion with these larger questions about longer term visioning, whatever that means. Again, to follow up on his point about the timeline being very difficult to pin down, but we do have this fundamental responsibility as the bearer of these resources for the benefit of future generations as yet unborn or very recently born, as in the case of one of our participants today, trying to take care of them with that kind of time frame and thinking about these things across maybe a few generations. So I really am supportive of that. Thanks for the heart, whoever put that up. It's we all are happy to see the new face on the commission. So anyway, just wanted to add that and continue to have a conversation around that and to continue to at least within our current rewriting have the door open for that long-term discussion, long-term protection of existing lands and resource values in those parks that we're especially paying attention to and anticipating longer-term demographic needs and all the things that go along with that as well. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm hoping, again, there's a couple of slides at the end here that I think touch on both the long-term kind of protection, but also the long-term needs for kind of future recreationalists. So thank you. All right, anything else on this one before we jump to the next? And the next one is the last actual criteria. So, all right. So community impact, this has been defined as benefits and has the support of local communities. And you can see here in rule that it talks about balance of need for and benefits of public open space with impacts on local tax revenue, private economy. And then down here, probably more relevant, a demonstration that the county, local community, interested state and federal agencies support the acquisition. I know that's been a big part of our practice in the past, that we're reaching out to county commissioners and cities and other jurisdictions to make sure that they're at least okay with the acquisition. Maybe they're not always super excited, but generally speaking, folks are okay with it. Any thoughts on that one?
Commissioner Grassi has his hand up.
Commissioner Grant?
So I just have one thought, and it's a caution more than anything else. There can be a struggle in this. I think about that gravel road that goes past the Alvord Desert in Harney County. And we got the funding from a federal source to pave that road. And one very loud individual stopped it. And it looked like from the outside there was no community support, but over and over we had showed that it was. So there's got to be a caution there about there are those of us who can be very loud. And how you weigh that in there and understand it is that, to me, that's the difficulty in this. Other than this, I think that criteria makes sense to have.
Thank you. Other thoughts on? Okay.
I'm struggling. Excuse me, I'm struggling a bit with this wording. As a criteria, does that mean if a county commissioner stands up and says, doesn't benefit me, I'm out, then this criteria is off the table? And it may benefit the state enormously, the statewide, but one constituency or a small one in the local area doesn't like it. And so by this criteria, well, it doesn't fit your criteria. I might go back to SCORE a little bit on this and find it. I think it's more important for me as an acquisition policy that we work proactively with all of the local people long before we've acquired.
Yep.
Okay, and so that's where I think the local people have the most impact and the most, one of our acquisition criteria, the way I put it is that we have worked proactive, ascertain what benefits this has for the local community and what impacts it might have on the local community as one of the considerations, rather than this as a criteria. This is almost after the fact, because if we haven't got this, why are we buying? Why are we putting our money down? On the other hand, sometimes you'll never get this wholeheartedly for all pieces of the local community. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I think you're saying the same thing I did.
Yeah, you just gotta go, this gotta go ahead. This is the donkey that's pulling the cart, and not all donkeys are happy, and this isn't a criteria. This is an important part of our process.
Yeah.
And we've equally tested it, like the paved road, like this is one that I can't see Dennis Comfort's face, and it's a good thing, because I'm gonna say the Brian Booth word.
Yeah,
And-
we're all thinking it.
But I mean, it's no different, right? You've had all of that support. We have a master plan that's already been approved, and then it doesn't, right? So like, I would never want to see us in a situation where we are making an acquisition that we have not had that community buy-in and support. Granted, it may change, new people get elected into those roles, new neighbors move in, like stuff happens, right? But we should never be in a situation that we have not already had those pre-conversations with the relationships we have at the time with the best intent of the community impact.
So I'm not
Sorry,
sure.
Dee.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm gonna finish here. I'm not sure what this needs, but I would like it to,
Is it a criteria?
it is
Yeah.
something that, I don't know. Maybe this is the best we can do wordsmithing, I don't know, but it
Yeah.
just seems,
No, I think, to your point, I think we can take this back, rework it, and then I think talk about whether it's a consideration or whether it is a criteria. Because I think we've seen, yeah, Dennis, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we could take out local communities and just put the word or the letter SCORP in, because local communities have a huge voice as well as the rest of the state. And so if you have congruency between the local and the state, that's a good criteria to make the jump. If you only have local but not the full state, that's half the battle, or vice versa. But so having SCORP be the driver of a decision where we're not sure, and that's the final vote to get us over the hump, I think that we could use that specifically, because that is the public process that they're asking us to use.
Well,
Sure, Christie.
so I'm gonna make a bit of a commitment here. The next time the SCORP comes up, long before it actually gets started, I would love to have a sit down with the team that's gonna do that about getting public input. But so that's my problem with SCORP. You may hit communities where the public input was wonderful and extensive, and you may hit communities that they went, what the heck's a SCORP, and didn't show up. And we all know that happened and happens on the last one. The last one I was involved with is so long ago, it was done on stone tablets, but I'm not really current on it, but I do know getting turnout in our community was very, very difficult. And so whoever wrote it, that part of it applied to Harney County, did it on his own perception, not on input. And it's got to get done. I understand that, but so that's, to me, I don't like interjecting SCORP there, but I also don't like having that loud voice that I was talking about, being able to undermine the community, whether it's a county judge or a commissioner or John Doe off the street that knows how to get things done politically. There's got to be a way to balance it, and I'm not sure I have the solution.
The SCORP has a steering committee that they'd love to have some outside voice on for sure. And then it's an education process. And then if folks still choose not to, what do? You have to have some sort of a process.
Yes, you do.
But, and I think there's enough criteria considerations in between SCORP and master planning efforts. I mean, there's enough public process there that, I mean, it's one of many considerations, but I think we could reword that community impact piece.
Okay.
Would we consider community impact and popular initiative both being reworded to where that is only one, both of them fall under one criteria?
That might be a better answer.
Will you repeat what you just said?
Putting community impact and popular initiative more together, because if it's popular enough and the community may or may not want to do it, but the popularity of the folks who would use it, it brings more voices.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm also curious about benefits. The way the OAR is, I mean, it looks like the benefits is directly related to tax revenue, and economic opportunity. It just seems so different from
dollars.
Yeah, exactly, from public support. I mean, we all know that there's plenty of initiatives that lead to good economic outcomes for communities that may not have local support. So, I mean, should we separate the two? Do we, how do you account for what benefit is, and is benefit go beyond economic impacts? I'm struggling with that particular word.
That recreational nexus, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any-
For the
I'm gonna look into that a little bit more. I don't have an answer, kind of off the top of my head. Commissioner Hill, thank you. It's a great point. Really good point. Okay, anything else on that one? Ooh, what a marathon. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the input. So are there any things, I guess, that come to mind as far as things that might be missing, whether that be considerations or criteria? Anything that kind of bubbles up in your mind that we're missing? We talked about the climate adaptation or climate resiliency piece. We'll add that into and rework that long range planning one, I think, for that one. So I think we've got that one covered. That was definitely one that came to mind for me. The other was let's see. Sorry if I'm gonna make you dizzy. Was this idea of diversity of values is called out in rule. And what I'm wondering is,
That was more like what's in the system.
some of the discussion we had around park classifications and what kind of experiences we're hoping to be able to provide kind of outside of the geographic area during that discussion. I think we might be able to kind of address that in that criteria. Other thoughts? Oh,
And maybe, Matt, when you get the draft, we can send the draft out earlier. And then the other thing you guys could challenge yourself to think about is if you were developing it today with no process, no policy, no rules, no statutes, what type of criteria would you want?
Boy, that's heavy
Considered.
thinking.
I know. We've given you most of it, right?
Yeah,
But is there something that missing if all of a sudden a property comes to you and it's one you really want or one you really don't, is everything there to support or deny it?
yeah.
Because
Great.
it'll come.
I have some thoughts about that, and it's 100% political, and I'd like to talk with Lynn, maybe Vicki for a few minutes on we get done, rather than the whole group.
Okay.
Commissioner Dewar?
Matt, for one, I really appreciate the presentation. This has really been good and helpful to go through and have conversations on all these individual points and some fairly specific language that I know you've been grappling with as well. So I just wanted to state my appreciation for that. It's well done and very helpful in many ways. And I know that a lot of the language kind of accrues with time. To some extent, we're looking at language that's been, vetted before, and that was vetted based on prior iterations. So this stuff is kind of it's an artifact in a way that comes forward into our time. Like we're saying, we're not inventing this from zero. And I recall language that from the past that has kind of gone by the wayside, maybe one generation back. There was, for example, this language about sort of iconic values, or sort of we had to demonstrate the iconic the iconic awesomeness of the particular landscape in question. It's interesting how that has disappeared and that we have other kinds of values coming forward. And I would be interested to get just a very brief discussion of how that was why that decision was made, that we lost some of that language, and just a reminder in some ways of how that became in some ways problematic, how it was difficult to sort of achieve those standards and so on. Just that because that used to be fairly central, as I recall, and now we really don't see that. Although I admit I was having some trouble logging on, so maybe there was something about iconic value of properties at the very beginning, but my recollection though is that was discarded, and there were very good reasons for why that was the case, and that it lent itself to a lot of big picture debates that were hard to resolve. So anyway, I'll stop and hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I definitely am going to ask for some support from Alice and Tabitha on that. because I don't know, the iconic language, I'm not sure. I know it has been replaced, I think, with significant. I think that's what we talk about now is significant natural resource, cultural resource, historic resource, recreation. But to be completely candid, I don't know when and why that changed. Maybe somebody else can help with that.
Well, I think I kind of heard what I was going to add to the in just what Matt summarized there, right? Is that I had listened to some old commission conversations from about a decade ago when these criteria were being put in place. And there were several commissioners who were talking about that iconic element, right? You look at it and you know it's supposed to be a state park, that kind of idea. And so much of the conversation sort of circled back around to, well, isn't that what the mission is about? If you're living out the mission, you are bringing these places into the fold that are part of that iconic Oregon experience. But we also might need these little, connection pieces and these things that are very practical for buffer and those kinds of things. So we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner with only going after things that meet that sort of wow factor. And so that's what I heard in that conversation, but I'd be curious to hear if others have thoughts.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're muted, Alice, sorry.
Sorry, that's what I recall also from back when all of this was being changed. Is there's also some pressure that comes with the idea of iconic. And so they were trying to recognize that it needed to be something significant, to have that pressure applied to us.
Right.
Because as you see, they speak to legislative direction telling us to do certain things and own certain properties and that type of thing. Right. So iconic can become a problem for us.
It's a high threshold.
Yeah. And
it's a high threshold. And I think that
interesting definition.
And whose opinion is it? Who is the one establishing what's iconic? Whose opinion is that? It'd be one thing if it's cultural or historical, then yes, we recognize that as being
natural. Something
important. What's natural?
Yeah.
There's not too many more Smith rocks around.
That's right. No, that's right. And I think that a lot of I'm seeing other state park systems and the national park system backing away from that kind of threshold, focusing more on pragmatic things and trying to engage practical needs in terms of the things we've been talking about today, access to communities.
It's significant.
Right. Embracing the diversity of the state more meaningfully. And because for a variety of reasons, I mean, a lot of those iconic places, either they've become public lands or they've been preserved in some other way already. So there aren't that many, in the national park system, there just aren't that many more Grand Canyons and so on out in the world to focus on. And so then you get onto the nuances of what are the practical needs for the long-term integrity of the resource and the land, how we are responding to and embracing the diversity of the constituencies around us and many other things, practical needs. And so I think that's my understanding is that, it was just always a hard threshold to meet. And I think it gets harder to meet with time and does send you down kind of an odd rabbit hole in terms of the debate about the value of a particular piece of land to meet that threshold. So significance is good. But I just recall, especially when I was first on the commission and we had some of the people from the prior generation, people like Cal, that word iconic was still, people would mention that word and then all begin to chuckle. And I kind of wondered what was up. It was like an inside joke, but there's a good reason why that word fell out of disuse. And then we look more at the significance for a very wide range of criteria, ultimately, to achieve.
An iconic property can be quite significant.
Right, exactly. Yeah. You can find a lot of things that are significant, but not iconic, but very hard to find something that's iconic and not significant. So significance is a bigger basket. It allows us to do more things. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alice.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Dewar. Next, JR, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I just, there's a couple things. One is kind of in line with what Doug was talking about, but first I was going to mention, I think Dennis has brought up a couple different times and it's just interesting that it's not called out specifically, is but whether we should call out the SCORP specifically. It seems we put out a lot of time, money and resources to develop that. It's interesting that it's not called out specifically in our considerations for acquisitions, and that doing that would address a lot of other considerations, whether it's some of our outreach, looking out towards underserved populations, recreation dead zones, all internal stuff we've talked about where we are lacking property or things. And I think SCORP talks a lot about that already. So that maybe it's worth doing a bigger call out for that in general. Then the second is kind of that second point is kind of the opposite of that, which is a lot of these, the SCORP specifically, but a lot of these are very recreation centered, and whether we need to call out in our considerations some of that other stuff like historic properties and natural resource properties and the values of those, because I feel like I think the majority of these are address more of the recreation based properties, and so maybe just to make it easier for us long term to make sure that there's kind of call outs, maybe not in the criteria, but maybe more definition and considerations on putting some flesh on the bone around what those criteria or considerations might be as far as historic values, and because they're not going to, as we all are quite aware, they generally aren't a fiscal driver for us. It's quite the opposite, but doesn't mean that we should let those opportunities pass when they come by. So those are kind of the two things I think we may want to look at calling out a little more in depth.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Commissioner Blasher.
Thanks. Yeah, just a few kind of like closing thoughts. I was trying to think working backwards because I know we're going to get into like the disposition policy, and that's sort of like the flip of this. So is there anything that's missing that would be really crucial for the disposition side of this that we're missing? I can't think of anything right now, but I know for me, I'll continue to think about that. I guess one thing that was kind of coming up too is these might be more about process than actual criteria, but I'm thinking about what are our considerations? And I think SCORP's trying to do more of this around diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is that analysis of looking at this? And it looks different across the state, but how are we thinking of who are people that are historically marginalized or aren't able to benefit and access the resources that we have, or sometimes it's just being involved in the process of knowing how some of these decisions are made. What are we thinking about when it comes to accessibility and sort of those different adaptive needs? And again, I know those get into a bit more of process. And I imagine some of this is also driven by around state's expectation around sort of what do those DEI equity analysis look like across all of our processes? But nonetheless, where do we maybe call out some of that of, an expectation that we'll go through, again, a process that really tries to bring more folks in, or get that right balance. I know we're talking about real estate negotiations, so there's only so much, but still being able to think about how that could further refine, or just another lens to look through for different levels of priorities. So that's one concept that I'm not sure where that might fit. Second, similar to that is it's probably in the statutes and language, but federal requirements and things like that, but also what do we have with requirements with tribes and cultural resource protection and sort of acknowledging that. And obviously we've got things coming up with like some other properties and things I know that where there have been those good partnerships, but is that again, a process thing, another thing to call out, or is that already embedded somewhere where in statute? And then the third concept I had, which again, maybe a process thing, is there anywhere in this criteria where I think we identified some of these are competing criteria, not necessarily opposed, but they create like that tension. So do we need to call out somewhere in criteria process how do you resolve that conflict? What is that sort of internal process? Again, whether that's another ranking system on top of a ranking system, but just sort of, hey, when it comes down to it, here's some of the ways that we'll try to distill and work through these different competing interests, whether it's, counties, states, local government folks, public, or it's, natural resource protection, cultural resource protection, just a little bit more of how that decision tree thought process goes into it. And again, I don't have all the answers now, just something I was thinking of that might come up is how you manage the conflict between these criteria. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. No, those are all really good points. And in terms of kind of the DEI and the accessibility of the properties, I thought about that a little bit. I know we talked about it as a group, and we'll try and figure out if we can work that in, because one of the conclusion that I kind of came to was a lot of those occur after a property has been purchased or is getting ready to be developed. That's when we use that lens, but is that the right time, or can we start looking at it a little bit earlier? And I think the same thing with kind of the requirements around cultural resources with tribes, with those kinds of things. I think that, some of that discussion may go into the, I think what we had is community impact, kind of that support for purchasing a piece of property. We don't have it outlined in there, as far as that connection with tribes and things like that. So those are all great points. And I was going to mention too, I really like, so I had made notes on getting the SCORP in there on a couple of these. I want to be careful not to tie too much to it because of the way that SCORPs are generally, or at least have been written, where they're not, and this is, I guess, maybe my own perspective, they're not as geared towards a lot of the more natural areas, and they are geared, I think, more towards developed areas. So I want to be careful about how we integrate that. But when Chrissy was talking about kind of the cooperation that SHPO does, say, with other agencies or private businesses, those kinds of things around identifying heritage resources, I think we have some room to improve there for sure in the criteria. So I just really appreciate all of the input, and to Tabitha and Alice and Cammie, who couldn't be here, and Jen and Lad and JR for just all the help putting this together. I was purely the mouthpiece, but they definitely did all the heavy lifting to put this together. So thank you all. Commissioner Allen.
This is just something that crossed my mind with what you were just saying, but I don't think this needs to be called out specifically, but also just input from something like the Office of Outdoor Recreation when you are, maybe it's in the SCORP process, maybe it's in something else, but a group that does represent a broader set of perspectives in terms of, and so I don't know where that fits. I wouldn't add it necessarily in writing somewhere, but it just seems like that's an important input to some of the other considerations we've talked about.
No, it's a great point. Anything else before we wrap this up? So my commitment will be that we'll work as a team, edit, review. We'll send that early so that you have a chance to kind of read through it prior to the next April meeting. And I think what I'll do is I'll put some questions in there too that maybe prompt kind of what Lisa was getting at, as far as if you didn't have rules or statute or any of that kind of stuff, what would be the key things we should be thinking about as we're acquiring or disposing of property? So I'll try and add some of those prompting type questions in there as well. And we didn't quite hit 3 hours. I'm sorry, this actually took longer than I thought it might, but I really, really appreciate it. This has been so helpful.
If anybody is calculating participants, we also could add a couple of other ones here. Listening carefully and are completely worn out by the almost 3 hour long discussion.
Jennifer, what does the snow look like at this point out your window?
Yeah, it's coming down.
Wow.
We've got probably 3 or 4 inches right now.
Wow.
There you go. Yep.
Okay.
Jonathan, you got a lie?
Yeah, this picture behind me is Lewis and Clark State Park that I took at about 10:30 this morning. And I know we were going to go out to the Portland Women's Forum, which is not far. It's even further east. So there's probably like 2 more inches than from this, like out at Lewis and Clark from when I took this photo. So yeah, it's nice and snowy here. Yeah.
I have to laugh because every February we've had this, now I've been with Parks almost 16 years, and every February we've gotten like snowed in the gorge, iced in the, at like everywhere. Maybe it's just a good idea to make February a virtual meeting.
Yeah. So as I watch too, JR, I'm pretty sure that one turkey is trying to bite your ear.
Awesome. Well, great job, Matt and team. Thank you for leading us through such a painful conversation, but necessary. So thanks, commissioners, for sticking with that long dialogue. We really truly do need your input and make sure we get this right so we can acquire and dispose of property with a little bit more confidence, especially as a couple of you are getting ready to leave us. It's always hard when I watch everybody finally get it and it's like, no, they're finally getting it and it's time to go. So we'll need this in place as two new people come in.
We didn't wake the baby.
We didn't wake the baby. She looks
Bye,
all
Clara.
snuggled.
I'll be up for the rest of the afternoon, so.
Well, Liz, if it helps, this was recorded, so you can play it to put her back to sleep. All right, you guys, we will see you tomorrow.
Oh, there she is.
Bye, folks. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
There we go. Boom.